I'm back. Okay, so, hey guys, Nup here, and today we're going to be reading some more of To Kill a Mockingbird. I'm doing this because someone I know was like, oh, I'm going somewhere, but I don't have a copy of the book, and I want to read it, but I don't have a copy, so I can't read it. So yeah, that's great. I got a like before I even got a view. Big mood. Okay, so here we're gonna start on page 13, on the second to last paragraph. Mrs. Radley ran screaming into the street. No, we're on the last paragraph, like the exactly last paragraph. Miss Stephanie said old Mr. Radley said no Radley was going to any asylum when it was suggested that a session in Tuscaloosa might be helpful to Boo. Boo wasn't crazy. He was high-strung at times. It was all right to shut him up. Mr. Radley conceded, but insisted that Boo jail. Big mood. The sheriff hadn't the heart to put him in jail alongside Negroes. I'm a person of color, so I'm really super brown, so I hope you don't get offended or anything. Please do not. So Boo was locked in the courthouse basement. Boo's transition from the basement to back home was nebulous in Jem's. Miss Stephanie Crawford said some of the town council told Mr. Radley that if he didn't take Boo back, Boo would die of mold from the damp. Besides, Boo could not live forever on the bounty of the county. Nobody knew what form of intimidation Mr. Radley employed to keep Boo out of sight, but Jem figured that Mr. Radley had kept him chained to the bed most of the time. Atticus said no, it wasn't that sort of thing, that there were other ways of making people into ghosts. My memory finally came alive to see Mrs. Radley occasionally open the front door, walk to the edge of the porch, pour water on her canvas. But every day, Jem and I would see Mr. Radley walking to and from town. He was a thin, leathery man with colorless eyes, so colorless they did not reflect light. His cheekbones were sharp, and his mouth was wide, with a thin upper lip and a full lower lip. Miss Stephanie Crawford said he was so upright he took the word of God as his only law, and we believed her, because Mr. Radley's posture was ramrod straight. He never spoke to us. When he passed, we would look at the ground and say, "Good morning, sir." And he would cough and reply. Mr. Radley's eldest son lived in Pensacola. He came home at Christmas, and he was one of the few persons we ever saw enter or leave the place. From the day Mr. Radley took Arthur home, people said the house died. But there came a day when Atticus told us he'd wear us out if we made any noise in the yard, and commissioned Calpurnia to serve in his absence if she heard a sound out of us. Mr. Radley was dying. He took his time about it. Wooden sawhorses blocked the road at each end of the Radley lot. Straw was put down on the sidewalk. Traffic was diverted to the back street. Dr. Reynolds parked his car in front of our house and walked to the Radleys every time he called. Jem and I crept around the yard for days. At last, the sawhorses were taken away, and we stood watching from the front porch when Mr. Radley finally made his journey past our house. "There goes the meanest man God ever blew breath into," murmured Calpurnia, and she spat meditatively into the yard. We looked at her in surprise, for Calpurnia rarely commented on the ways of white people. The neighborhood thought, when Mr. Radley went under, Boo would come out. But it had another thing coming. Boo's elder brother returned from Pensacola and took Mr. Radley's place. The only difference between him and his father were their ages. Jem said that Mr. Nathan Radley bought cotton, too. Mr. Nathan would speak to us, however, when we said good morning, and sometimes we saw him coming from town with a magazine in his hand. The more we told Dill about the Radleys, the more he wanted to know. The longer he would stay hugging the light pole on the corner, the more he would wonder. Wonder what he does in there, he would murmur. Looks like he'd just stick his head out the door. Jem said, he goes out all right when it's pitch dark. Miss Stephanie Crawford said she woke up in the middle of the night one time and saw him looking straight through the window at her. Said his head was like a skull look at her. Ain't you ever waked up at night and heard him, Dill? He walks like this. And Jim slid his feet through the gravel. Why do you think Miss Rachel locks up so tight at night? I've seen his tracks in our backyard many a morning, and one night I saw him scratching on the back screen, but he was gone time Atticus got there. Wonder what he looks like, said Dill. Jem gave a reasonable description of Boo. Boo was about 6.5 feet tall, judging from his tracks. He dined on raw squirrels and any cats he could catch. That's why his hands were blood-stained. If you ate an animal raw, you could never wash the blood off. There was a long, jagged scar that ran across his face. What teeth he had were yellow and rotten. His eyes popped, and he drooled most of the time. Let's try to make him come out, said Dill. I'd like to see what he looks like. Jem said that if Dill wanted to get himself killed, all he had to do was go up and knock on the front door. Our first raid came to pass only because Dill bet Jem the Grey Ghost against 2 Tom Swifts that Jem wouldn't get any farther than the Radley Gate. In all his life, Jem had never declined a dare. Jem thought about it for 3 days. I suppose he loved honor more than his head, for Dill wore him down easily. You're scared, said Dill. The first day, ain't scared, just respectful, Jem said. The next day, Dill said, You're too scared even to put your big toe in the front yard. Jem reckoned he wasn't, and he'd pass the Radley place every school day of his life. Always running, I said. But Dill got him the third day, when he told Jem that folks in Meridian weren't certainly as afraid as the folks in Maycomb, that he'd never seen such scary folks as the ones in Maycomb. This was enough to make Jem march to the corner, where he stepped and leaned against the light pole, watching the gate, hazing crazily on its homemade hinge. I hope you've got it through your head that he'll kill each and every one of us, Dill Harris, said Jem, when we joined him. Don't blame me when he gouges your eyes out. You started it, remember. You're still scared, murmured Dill patiently. Jem wanted Dill to know, once and for all, that he wasn't scared of anything. It's just that I can't think of a way to make him come out without him getting us. Besides, Jem had his little sister to think of. When he said that, I knew he was afraid. Jem had his little sister to think of the time I dared to jump off the top of the house. If I got killed, what'd become of you? He asked. Then he jumped, landed unhurt. His sense of responsibility left him until confronted by the Radley place. You're gonna run out on a dare? Asked Dill. If you are, then. Dill, you have to think about these things, Jem said. Let me think a minute. It's sort of like making a turtle come out. How's that? Asked Dill. Strike a match under him. I told Jem that if he set fires to the Radley house, I was going to tell Atticus on him. Dill said striking a match under a turtle was hateful. Ain't hateful, just persuades them. It's not like you'd chuck him in the fire, Jem growled. How do you know a match don't hurt him? Turtles can't feel, stupid, said Jem. Were you ever a turtle? Huh? My stars, Dill. Now let me think. Reckon we can rock him. Jem stood and thought so long that Dill made a mild concession. I won't say you ran out on a dare, and I'll swap you the Grey Ghost if you just go up and touch the house. Jem brightened. Touch the house? That's all? Dill nodded. Sure, that's all now. I don't want you hollering something's different the minute I get back. Yeah, that's all, said Dill. He'll probably come out after you when he sees you in the yard, and Scout and me will jump on him and hold him down till we can tell him we ain't gonna hurt him. We left the corner, crossed the side street that ran in front of the Radley house, and stopped at the gate. We'll go on, said Dill. Scout and me's right behind you. I'm going. Don't hurt me. He walked to the corner of the lot, then back again, studying the simple terrain as if deciding how to best effect an entry, frowning and scratching his head. Then I sneered at him. Jem threw open the gate and sped to the side of the house, slapped it with his palm, and ran back past us, not waiting to see if his foray was successful. Dill and I followed on his heels. Safely on our porch, panting and out of breath, we looked back. The old house was the same, droopy and sick. But as we stared down the street, we thought we almost saw an inside shutter move, flick. A tiny, almost invisible movement, and the house was still. Dill left us in September to return to Meridian. I'm finally on chapter 2. It's not like it's taken me, I think, 40 minutes. 40 minutes isn't a lot. Without him. Until it occurred to me that I would be at school in a week. I never looked forward more to anything in my life. Hours of winter time found me in the treehouse, looking over at the schoolyard, spying on multitudes of children through a 2-power telescope Jem had given me, learning their games, following Jem's red jacket through wriggling circles of blind man's, secretly sharing their misfortune and minor victories. I longed to join them. Jem condescended to take me to school the first day, a job usually done by one's parents, but Atticus had said Jem would be delighted to show me where my room was. I think some money changed hands in this transaction, for as we trotted around the corner past the Radley place, I heard an unfamiliar jingle in Jem's pockets. When we slowed to walk at the edge of the schoolyard, Jem was careful to explain that during school hours I was not to bother him. I was not to approach him with requests to enact a chapter of Tarzan and the Ant-Man, to embarrass him with references to his private life, or tag along behind him at recess and noon. I was to stick with the first grade, and he would stick with the 5th. In short, I was to leave him alone. So you mean we can't play anymore? I asked. We'll do like we always do at home, but you see, school's different. It certainly was. Before the first morning was over, Miss Caroline Fisher, our teacher, hauled me up, patted the palm of my hand with a ruler, then made me stand in the corner until noon. Monday? No. Miss Caroline was no more than 21. She had bright auburn hair, pink cheeks, and wore crimson fingernail polish, high-heeled pumps, and a red and white striped dress. She looked and smelled like a peppermint drop. She boarded across the street one door down from us in Miss Maudie Atkinson's upstairs front room, and when Miss Maudie introduced us to her, Jem was a haze for days. Miss Caroline printed her name on the blackboard and said, "This says, I am Miss Caroline Fisher. I am from North Alabama, from Winston County." The class murmured apprehensively, should she prove to harbor the share of peculiarities indigenous to that region. When Alabama seceded from the Union, January 11, 1861, Winston County seceded from Alabama, and every child in Macomb County knew it. North Alabama was filled with liquor interests, big mules, steel companies, Republicans, professors, and no persons or other persons of no background. Miss Caroline began the day by reading us a story about cats. The cats had long conversations with one another. They wore cunning little clothes and lived in a warm house behind a kitchen stove. By the time Mrs. Cat called the drugstore for an order of chocolate malted mice, the class was wriggling like a bucket full of worms. Miss Caroline seemed unaware that the ragged, denim-shirted, and flower-sack-skirted first grade, most of whom had chopped cotton and fed hogs from the time that they were able to walk, were immune to imaginative literature. Miss Caroline came to the end of the story and said, "Oh my, wasn't that nice?" Then she went to the blackboard and printed the alphabet in enormous square letters, then turned to the class and asked, "Does everybody know what these are?" Everybody did. Most of the first grade had failed it last year. I suppose she chose me because she knew my name. As I read the alphabet, a faint line appeared between her eyebrows. After making me most of my first reader and the stock market quotations from the mobile register aloud, she discovered I was literate and looked at me with more than faint distaste. Miss Caroline told me to tell my father to not teach me any more, that it would infuriate. Teach me? I said in surprise. He hasn't taught me anything, Miss Caroline. Atticus ain't got time to teach me anything, I added, when Miss Caroline smiled and shook her head. Why, he's so tired at night, he just sits in the living room and reads. If he didn't teach you, who did? Miss Caroline asked good-naturedly. Somebody did. You weren't born reading the mobile register. Jem says I was. He read in a book where I was a bullfinch instead of a finch. Jem says my name's really Jean Louise Bullfinch, that I got swapped when I was born, and I'm really a... Miss Caroline apparently thought I was lying. Let's not let our imaginations run away with us, dear, she said. Tell your father not to teach you any more. It's best to begin reading with a fresh mind. You tell him. I'll take over from here and try to undo the damage, ma'am. Your father does not know how to teach. You can have a seat now. I mumbled that I was sorry and retired, meditating upon my crime. I never deliberately learned to read, but somehow I was wallowing illicitly in the daily papers. In the long hours of church, was it then I learned? Why am I taking so long? I could not remember not being able to read hymns. Now that I was compelled to think about it, reading was something that just came to me as learning to fasten the seat of my union suit, or achieving 2 bows from a snarl of shoelaces. I cannot remember when the lines above Atticus's moving finger separated into words, but I had stared at them all evenings in my memory, listening to the news of the day, bills to be enacted to laws, the diaries of Lorenzo Doe. Anything Atticus happened to be reading when I crawled into his lap every night, until I feared I would lose it. I never loved to read. One does not love breathing. And that's where I'm finally gonna end. We are on page 18, and we're halfway through chapter 2. No, we're not. We're close to 1/4 of chapter 2. Oh god, my phone's burning up. Oh well. Okay, so bye-bye. Have a nice day.